Dan, welcome to Inner Immigrant.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
I wanted to have you on because you are a professor and you teach a course on Christian nationalism.
Right.
And I really think that obviously Christian nationalism is in the news, and we don't always understand what it means and how it differs from just being a Christian who is patriotic or who loves your country. So I wanted to have you on to talk a little bit about Christian nationalism, what it is, and where it comes from.
Okay. Sure.
Sure.
Happy to do that. So, actually, I was teaching about this very topic at my church yesterday. I'm doing a 2-week session on Christian nationalism at my parish. So I've been thinking about this, and it's just helpful to get some of the categories out first. Like, what's nationalism, right?
Okay.
So, like nationalism, we could say something like a group identity that's that is coalescing around things like ethnic identity or political identity or cultural identity, and is trying to create a nationalist movement around that, right? And not all nationalist movements are the same as like a state, right? So we have like a Kurdish national movement, right? Even though Kurdistan isn't a political entity, right? So an identity around this quality of belonging to this Kurdish ethnic group. Okay, so we could talk about so nationalism just exists in the world. It isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just there. So then religious nationalism on top of that is attaching specific kinds of religious symbols, narratives, or ideas on top of that ethnic nationalism. And
Okay.
so, for example, in contemporary India with the BJP party and Narendra Modi, that is a specific kind of Hindu nationalism that says only Hindus ought to control aspects of Indian life, which is really difficult because there's multiple other kinds of religions in India. Okay, so we have that as an example, and so then in the United States there's a particular kind of Christian nationalism um, that develops over time. And we could get into this a little bit later. I shared with you before that I was raised in something that I call Christian or Christian nationalist adjacent in the 70s and 80s. So there's been threads of this throughout. But the core idea here is that America is a divinely chosen country by God. America is meant to be a specifically Christian nation, and that there are both internal and external elements that threaten the Christian idea of the country. And if the Christian identity of the country is threatened, the country itself will fail. So
Okay.
those are some of the core dynamics of Christian nationalism.
Okay. And so it's not the same. You could be a Christian who loves America and, loves the 4th of July or loves the Constitution and not necessarily be a Christian nationalist.
Correct. So patriotism is different than nationalism.
Okay.
Right. So what nationalism is trying to do is say that there is a core group that is the authentic representatives of what this state ought to be.
Okay.
Okay. Whereas patriotism, so that's allegiance to an in-group, and then it identifies out-groups who threaten that allegiance. Whereas patriotism is actually loyalty to something external to your own group, like the Constitution or democratic norms or a particular kind of form of governance. And so patriotism then operates not on in-group, out-group dynamics, but whether one has a certain kind of fidelity to external elements. Now, patriotism can go wrong also. It's not as if patriotism is a pure thing. Nationalism can go well sometimes, and nationalism can go terribly wrong at other times.
Right. And so what you're trying to distinguish is the way that words are used. And I think one of the things that's really challenging about the reelection of Trump in our particular moment is that many people long for some kind of faith. The majority of people in the United States of America who claim a faith claim Christianity. And so I know for many people, when they saw, for example, prayer at Trump's inauguration,
Mhm.
or they saw Christian symbols in the MAGA movement, they were happy to see those things because they represent to them goodness, God, the idea
Mhm.
that there's meaning in life. There's this great longing for of some kind of meaning and faith, I think. And only one party was kind of speaking the language of faith, or using Christian symbols. But they can also be used in ways that are really disingenuous, and don't correspond with actual Christian teachings. So it can be very confusing, I think, for ordinary people to parse.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you talked about Trump's inauguration, that there was prayer there. There's prayer every presidential inauguration. And what's really
Yeah.
striking to me is actually Joe Biden's inauguration in 2020. I don't know if you watched it. But at the very end, you had one of our big country stars in the 90s singing Amazing Grace,
Yeah.
which is like about as Christian as you can get.
Yeah.
And so there's a ways in which Christian symbolism just pervades American political discourse, and both Democrats and Republicans use religious discourse. You just have to have the ears to hear it.
Right.
And so what's interesting is a narrative that Republicans are Christians and Democrats aren't, which isn't true. But we could talk about the ways in which the Democratic Party downplayed Christian identity in order to create a different vision of a pluralistic religious country.
Right.
That's kind of a difference of Christian nationalism versus a vision of a pluralist Republican democratic system in which religious toleration is the norm. And
That's
so the
right.
Christian nationalist is anxious when other religions are permitted to also share the stage. That something feels like it's being lost at that moment.
Right. I think that's really helpful. So what are some of the when you talk about the ethnic, because to me it's strange to have a nationalism associated with Christianity if it's tied to a particular ethnic or racial group,
Right.
because Christianity by its very nature is not a religion that you're born into. You don't have to
Mhm.
be of a certain ethnic group. In fact, it's in every country in the world. So why would Christianity, Christian nationalism, can you speak to that a little bit, be tied with a particular ethnic or racial identity?
Yeah. So this is one of the elements that scholars of Christian nationalism have kind of developed is this term white Christian nationalism. And one of the things to just keep in mind is white here is being used as another kind of identity marker. And so we want to talk about something like whiteness, which is the ways in which the idea of, let's just call it Euro American culture,
Mhm.
is presumed to be the norm and potentially superior to other forms of cultural expression and civilization. One of the dynamics that works, and here I'm pulling on the scholarship of two people from Notre Dame, Atalia Omer and Jason Springs, who've written about religious nationalism. Is in the United States, religious nationalism draws on like two elements that are from Protestantism. One is a Puritan strand. So if you ever read John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity, which is the document he writes on the ship the Puritans are in Boston Harbor, it's where we have the famous line of this new settlement will be a city on a hill and a light to the world, right? What the Puritans had was a quest for an exercise of their particular kind of religious freedom for themselves, in which certain ideas like they're being divinely called, their unique covenant with God. God is providentially watching over their behavior, and God will reward them for living righteously. They envision themselves as a new Israel. This is why in New England, where I live, you have so many place names named after places in the Bible: Salem, Bethel, New Canaan, et cetera, where they literally saw it as a new promised land. And the inhabitants are actually Canaanites, the
Mhm.
Native Americans. And so if the Canaanites don't collaborate with their project, you're permitted to exterminate them, which is what happens in the early wars in the 17th century. And so what you get early on is this fusion of of English Christian cultural identity with a particular kind of religion, and that's a beginning point of a kind of Christian nationalism on one end, right? And so you see that trajectory unfolding with ideas like manifest destiny, right? Like uh, the people who control this country have a warrant divinely given by God to take the rest of the land. Who are these people? White Protestant Christians, or we could say Euro-American Protestant Christians. So that's one trajectory. The other trajectory is Enlightenment thinking, which also comes out of an Anglo-American Protestant context. Think of the Scottish Enlightenment, people like John Locke, English thinkers who are influenced by it. That is ideas of notions of universal rationality, God-given rights, the importance of religious toleration for the stability of the state. We see those ideas playing out in things like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. We find these truths to be self-evident, that the Creator has endowed all people with X, Y, and Z, right? And the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that creates another notion that's operative in the United States, which is the United States is going to represent the paragon of the ideal form of self-governance, Republican democracy, and that other nations are going to be held to that standard of what the United States is. That is a we could call a liberalizing form of Protestant Christianity. We see that play out in things like the Monroe Doctrine, where other nations in the Western Hemisphere ought to be held up to the same standards as the United States, or in things like the Marshall Plan and the creation of the post-World War II Cold War global order, where the ideals of the United States are put into tension with the Soviet Union. Of course, the ideals of the United States represent what? The paragon of inherently Protestant Christian values.
Yeah.
So we see those two overlapping. That creates two different trajectories that help create this fusion of a particular kind of Euro-American identity with various strands of Protestant Christianity.
Right. I mean, it's a very weird moment to be watching politics and to be caring about America, because a lot of really old ideas are new again. And so
Right.
things that had kind of fallen out of fashion to speak of America as a Christian nation or a white nation, kind of 1930s era ideas are very much back in vogue. I mean, anti-Semitism is openly expressed, both on the far left and the far right. Anxieties about non-white cultures as being like polluting or something of this nature.
Yes.
So a lot of these kind of old ideas that we see in our history have come back into the mainstream in a really emotional and kind of frightening way, because we see things, for example, with ICE, the situation unfolding in Minneapolis. A lot of the people being targeted by ICE are not only illegal immigrants, but they're often from Catholic or non-white countries, right? And
Right.
so it's a kind of a frightening time to live, where you see this kind of open hatred or bigotry or terrorizing of people from quote unquote the wrong identity groups, versus how the white South African refugees are being treated by the administration, welcomed with open arms, even though they're not Americans, but they look a certain way, right? They look European.
Right.
So
Right.
that's an odd thing.
Yeah, and that they are specifically from a Dutch Protestant culture, right?
Mm,
So they're the right kind of refugees to let in. I mean, the real issue with immigration is what happened in 1965 when the immigration laws are changed and the quotas are shifted to permit people globally to enter the United States, whereas prior to 1965, it was very hard for non-Europeans to enter the United States. And that shifts in 1965. Um, and that is what leads to this really interesting demographic shift in the United States. And then the policy of refugee resettlement of places essentially where America waged war at various times, whether it was Vietnam, Cambodia, later Iraq, Afghanistan, of course, various places in Central America like El Salvador, Nicaragua, where we have these resettlement programs in places like Minneapolis, um, that lead to these cultural shifts that then cause this anxiety among white nationalists that there's a sense that something about America is being lost or taken from them.
Right. And I think when you have had dominance, living in a system of equality can feel like a loss. So
Hmm.
if you have the society has rapidly changed in the last, let's say, 20 years, where now you have gay marriage, for example. So you have gay people having equal rights with straight people, or you have women entering the workforce, or you have demographic changes where your community is no longer majority people who look like you.
Hmm.
And what might be actually equality under the law could be perceived as a loss of dominance or power
Yeah.
for a group who did have dominance or power, white Protestant men.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, this is all really interesting because, of course, Somalis don't dominate the Twin Cities. I think there's only like 40,000 Somalis, right? It's not as large of a demographic, but it's noticeable. But where do they work? I mean, my in-laws live in the Twin Cities. They work in service jobs. If you fly into the airport in Minneapolis, it's Somalis who are the people who are doing the wheelchairs and the luggage, or they used to be the people who are the parking garage attendants. Um, and so the question is like, what's being lost with having uh, this cultural shift? Minnesota is still an overwhelmingly like white state. I can't tell you the demographics of Protestant versus Catholic. There's a strong Catholic presence in Minnesota. There's a very strong Lutheran Scandinavian presence, and so uh, it's interesting what anxiety does, because sometimes anxiety doesn't allow you to take a step back and think through what is happening. Um,
Yeah, and using the word anxiety is very apropos, I think, because a lot of the appeals from Christian nationalist movement are more based in emotion than reason. And it can feel scary or frightening to see things change. And I actually do have some sympathy. So I grew up in Colorado Springs. I still live here. So I know many, many evangelicals, which is kind of the community where I associate most with Christian nationalism.
yeah.
And I think for some of them, things like seeing the White House draped in the rainbow flag,
Mhm.
is hard for them because you know that your opinion and your belief that is deeply held is now a minority point of view.
Mhm.
So I have some sympathy for people who feel anxiety or feel emotional about changes in society. But it's not, like you said, that those people are actually losing any of their rights or freedoms to live as they see fit and to exercise their religion, or that people are losing any rights or freedoms to pursue the American dream because there are Somali immigrants working in service jobs. So it can feel like more of an emotional appeal than a purely rational appeal to folks who feel that something has shifted and they feel anxious about it.
Yeah, and I was raised evangelical, and so I certainly understand this worldview as well, of the sense of a fortress mentality that something's being chipped away. And I was raised with this again, as I said, in the 70s and 80s, and so you think that this is a 50-year long narrative. And part of the message was you have to create an alternative to this to take back what was lost. Take America back again. Take America back for God. This was a refrain I heard often growing up in evangelicalism. And it's really an interesting sense that somehow we are responsible for America to be exclusively Christian. This is the ideal. America ought to be exclusively Christian, and that's a really interesting claim to interrogate. In part because certain parts of evangelicalism, especially the Baptist tradition, have a doctrine of soul conscience that is one cannot be compelled to choose a religion. And so there's
Mhm.
some strands of Baptist theology that are pluralists, but then some strands of Baptist theology have really hived off that kind of thinking. And
Right,
it
like the
raises
Anabaptist versus Southern Baptist.
right, right. It really it's a really interesting question about how fragile do we think God is? That we have to do this for God, because actually it's God who is sovereign and not humans, right? And so this is a really interesting question of how what's the social vision for enacting Christian values?
Right. I mean, I think you're an interesting person to have on because you still identify as a Christian. You're an Episcopal priest and a
Right.
professor of Christian theology, but you're not a Christian nationalist. And I think one of my critiques might be that Christian nationalism is actually not Christian enough in the sense that Jesus says explicitly, my kingdom is not of this world. And so trying to kind of wed the state project with the Christian project is always going to be somewhat problematic because states are about consolidating power and Jesus is about, loving your enemies, and he's saying my kingdom is not of this world, your citizenship is in heaven. So
Mhm.
again, why are we encouraging people to think that everyone must be compelled to follow this religion, prayer in schools, etc.?
Yeah, yeah, and this is really a really interesting thread that you're finding in Christian nationalists. Doug Wilson, who runs a big Christian nationalist project out of Moscow, Idaho, in particular. You hear people are in his circle. Pete Hesketh's Secretary of Defense is like directly a disciple of his, where they critique the ideas of compassion and empathy, and
Hmm.
in particular, they argue empathy is not a Christian virtue. Um, and for me, like this is so profoundly unchristian to the
Hmm.
point where I might even try out our old term. It might actually be antichrist
Hmm.
to make these kinds of arguments. That G- that what's the core of the teaching of Jesus is we could look at things like the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew and Luke. We could look at the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke. We could ask about the teaching of what is the greatest commandment. Over and over again, it returns to love. And this notion that love is weakness or empathy is weakness is really interesting because, of course, Paul and Christ both talk about how the greatest strength is being found in weakness. And the inversion that those who think they're strong or powerful will actually be overthrown. So, Christian nationalism at its end is about power. It's the weighing of religion to power through the vehicle of the state. And so, of course, the teachings about love, empathy, compassion, serving rather than being served threaten that wedding of power to Christianity.
Yes, and so it's funny because we have these very simple teachings, love your neighbor as yourself, very clear teachings that can be distorted by very intelligent, highly educated people. So J.D. Vance, the vice president, claims Catholicism, and yet he's been in an argument now with two popes over love of neighbor, right? And he wanted to argue that your neighbor does not include the house full of 15 immigrants, right? Your neighbor is first your family and then your country, and then if you have anything left to give, right?
Yeah,
And so Pope Francis called him out on that and said, no, your neighbor is whoever is in front of you. And that might be someone who is also difficult for you to love because you might have prejudice against that person, but you're still
right.
commanded to have care for them. And so we have different interpretations of theology, which are having really profound impacts on political policy and the idea of what makes for a good country.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very interesting moment because, of course, Francis has been identified as like this liberal pope, which um, it really depends on what you think your definition of liberal is.
Yeah.
Because, in some ways, he's simply, he would speak off the cuff at moments, and he get himself in trouble. But then when you look at like his actual teachings that he issues, they are firmly within the center of the Catholic tradition. And
Right. And so
similarly,
Catholicism really presents a problem for Christian nationalism because it has many quote unquote conservative views, and all of the popes are consistent on those. For example, opposition to abortion or traditional teachings about marriage. And yet it has very radical views when it comes to welcoming the stranger and caring for the poor. And so it presents this problem if you want to say Christianity is solely associated with the Republican Party.
Right.
Because the largest Christian group in the world, the Catholic Church, doesn't fit within that kind of binary.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting moment. I think on my end, I'm in the Episcopal Church, which over the course of the 20th century made this a very interesting move from being associated with the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. We could call it, instead of being the Republican Party at prayer, we could call it NPR listeners at prayer now, right? Um, And, I have my own discomfort with the ways in which one assumes a form of Christianity aligns exclusively with a political party or a political movement. I think Christianity, the gospel always requires a transcendence of political categories. Europe historically had various kind of Christian identified parties that weren't Christian nationalists, though, right?
Uh,
Like the Christian Democrats in Germany, for instance, were sort of center right. They were trying to live out Catholic values within a democratic system, right? And that's good, and that should be a way in which you. It's a classically political liberal movement in saying the marketplace of ideas is where we'll test out our values
yeah,
and we'll reason together around this. Um, I think we really need to have an important moment in which there can be a recapturing of a moral imagination that Christians across elements of the American political spectrum share to say, like, these extremes that we're encountering, whether it's Christian nationalism, I have critiques of the left as well that are of a different category. Those need to be pushed against. And I think there needs to be a recentering on constitutional norms, right? Like basic things that ensured human dignity. That's one of the interesting things that evolved in the Catholic Church in the second half of the 20th century is recognizing that Republican, democratic, constitutional norms help preserve human dignity. And that those things go together because they had experiences of authoritarianism on the right with Nazism and to a lesser degree, Franco's Spain and Mussolini's Italy, and then Soviet totalitarianism.
yeah. And that's another thing that makes us feel that we're living in the history book is that, I'm thinking of like Weimar Germany before Hitler became chancellor. And there was a lot of economic distress, and a lot of people were fed up with democracy and they were drawn towards kind of radical groups, whether it was communism or the Nazis. And I kind of see that same sort of happening in the United States, where a lot of people are giving up on the idea of a liberal democracy and drawn towards these kind of extremists that they're hearing online. And so it's very difficult to make a case for norms in that kind of an environment when people are upset about a lot of things, or the United States is struggling in some ways economically. But we have to keep trying because we don't want to live in a totalitarian government, left or right. And we also don't want to live in a country where minorities don't have rights because depending on who's in charge, we could be that minority group. And so I want to speak a little bit about because you teach about Christian and Jewish studies, about the rise in anti-Semitism, because Jews are kind of the ultimate minority group. They are such a small part of the US population, and yet such a big part of the conversation.
Yeah. The class I teach is called Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Christian Nationalism. I developed it as a way of thinking through the 2020 January 6th or 2021 January 6th insurrection, where you had things like people wearing Camp Auschwitz hoodies as part of the insurrectionist mob. You had really explicit anti-Semites part of the group. Nick Fuentes was outside cheering people on. He didn't go inside. Nick Fuentes, our big anti-Semite, Catholic anti-Semite. And race, which I don't think we can talk about American authoritarianism without talking about race. It's just encoded within it. one of the things that scholars of anti-Semitism point out is that the way that we think racially in the West develops out of thinking about Jews. That Jews are the original other in Christian discourse. We see this early on in the second century. Just to fast forward, when we get into the Middle Ages, we see the beginnings of what scholars call the biologizing of Jews. That is, associating Jews with particular physical features. We find this in 11th and 12th century England, for instance, where some of the stereotypical writings about Jewish physical appearances start to develop. What really is crucial is in the 15th and 16th centuries with the Spanish Inquisition. What the Spanish Inquisition is the response, it's an anxiety response of Jews who converted to Christianity. They get called the New Christians. They begin to intermarry with what's called the Old Christians, the people who've been Christian for generations. And all of a sudden, Spaniards become anxious about the mixing of blood and blood purity. And so the notions we have of blood purity and the idea that like one drop makes you black, which is kind of the one drop theory, or the ways in which we try to deal with issues of blood quantum with Native Americans to determine if they're really Native American, all that traces back to racialized ways of thinking about Jews in late medieval Spain and early modern Spain. And so those connecting points are really important. And so anti-Semitism, as it develops in the 19th century, gets associated with authoritarian movements as a way of saying the problems of society we're going to pin on Jews because Jews have always existed as this other who's visible in society. And the racializing discourses that occur with Nazism get developed in around the 1870s in Germany and then quickly spread to places like France and England, and then to the United States, actually. So we find that anti-Semitism, when it shows up in society, is often a warning sign of gathering authoritarianism, at least in our modern context. And that's why it feels important for me to like name that as part of the movement. And we're seeing this play out now. With on the right, people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, who I've already mentioned, and a range of other folks increasingly associated with that. We have some Christian nationalists like Joel Wembaum, who's affiliated with Doug Wilson's movement, also talking this way. We also have on the left, with especially around the discourses around Israel and Zionism, where the problem with Israel is it comes to represent all the problems of the world. All the social order problems get pinned on Jews, whether it's so the notion that any kind of no oppressive regime in the world, the thinking goes, will really ever come to an end until Zionism comes to an end. Just like over on, and then you have the economic claims that both ends of the spectrum make, that somehow there is a Jewish manipulation of economies that harms the underclass. The underclass needs to be protected, whether it's designated as the white underclass or the proletariat underclass. They need to be protected against these capitalist depredations.
Yeah, it's very concerning because anyone who knows history knows, as you said, that these sort of beliefs being openly spoken about tends to precede totalitarian movements, but also because human beings love having a scapegoat or a devil. And it's helpful if that devil is a small group of people that you don't actually know very well or know very much about.
Right.
And the Jews kind of have played that role often throughout history because they are such a small percentage of the population. And because they live a distinct way of life, or they have a distinct, like you said, dress or look. And so they can be easily scapegoated to represent evil incarnate. And so kind of we've seen moments of this, like where, kind of the satanic panic in the 80s or something, where people have a general concern about the direction that society is going, and they are looking for an explanation for that. And Hitler famously said, like, if the Jews hadn't existed, I would have had to invent them. It's very effective rhetorically to have a group of people who can represent all evil in order to rally the people together. But that is always what precedes any kind of war or any kind of violence, as we're seeing, violence in the streets sometimes with ICE agents. So we have to be very careful not to oversimplify something like distrust on the left with the Israeli government and their persecution of Palestinians, having that can easily slide and slip into a generalization about all Jewish people, or something on, I think, Tucker Carlson on the far right as well. It begins with not wanting to spend American money in other countries' wars, fine, can slip into just a hatred of the Jewish people as a group, then becoming a scapegoat.
Yeah, yeah. And so we have really interesting examples of this. Like, it's like the Bondi Beach attack in Australia on this Hanukkah celebration. We know this seems to be motivated by some sort of anti-Israeli feeling. Okay, so we could categorize that somewhere on the left. The Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 2018, we know the shooter there because he wrote a manifesto, attacked that place because he thought they were affiliated with an entity called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was a Jewish organization formed in the early 20th century to aid Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. After those waves of immigration ended, they just became a society that aided refugee resettlement.
Mm-hmm.
But right-wing conspiracy theories labeled this entity as the vehicle by which this invasion of America was happening. And so in the shooter's mind, we have to destroy Jews because they are the ones who are destroying America. So we see that like the ideas do result in murder. And so that's why we need to act with alarm about this, and as Christians really work to stop the proliferation of these ideas in whatever way we can.
Yeah. And the interesting term is the word invasion, right? So again, using words in new ways. Typically we think of invasion as like a military operation, but
Mhm.
here we're often now hearing from Christian nationalists that the country is being invaded even by immigrants who came here legally through refugee resettlement programs. And so
Right.
they're twisting language, or they'll say the Catholic Church is, aiding these invaders whose purpose is to destroy Western civilization, when really the Catholic Church has always engaged in charitable work and is just doing what it has always done, which is helping people find a house or a job when they are new to a country.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. But it gives you a real sense of again this notion that America is meant for some people inherently and not for others.
Yeah.
And that's an important element for us to pay attention to.
How do your students react to your course on Christian nationalism? I would love to hear like what their responses are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've taught twice. I'm going to be teaching again next fall. So I offer this as an elective. I've had good enrollment both times. I really think a lot about the students I had last time, which was the fall of 2024. So it was the election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. One of the things that's really interesting here at Boston College is it's a pretty small Jewish population. Maybe 300 students of 9,000 undergraduates. So they're pretty tight and close. Um, and they are very eager, though, to engage with Boston College's Catholic Jesuit identity. For a lot of them, it's why they come. They feel more comfortable being at a place that's explicit about religious identity rather than putting it off to the side. So in that class, what was interesting is the leader of the Democrat club and the leader of the Republican club were both in the class. They were both Jewish, and
Wow.
that was really fascinating. And then they had friends they brought to the class as well, and so you had this interesting mix of basically half Republican, half Democrat, half Christian of various stripes, and half Jewish of various stripes. With a sprinkle, I also had one of our students from our school of theology and ministry who was a Jesuit from the Congo, who was actually curious about thinking about American nationalism to reflect back on African nationalism.
Yeah.
And so it was just a fascinating mix So one of the things I tried to make really explicit in the class was um, the purpose of this class is not to advocate for particular political positions, but rather to try to understand particular movements. And so I'm a real believer that that as a professor, my role here is to cultivate intellectual curiosity and the virtues of the mind. Most of the Republican students were, as far as I know, never Trumpers. Like they were not in support of Trump. They viewed him as dangerous. A lot of them had coalesced around Nikki Haley as an alternative. Um, it was really helpful. We were really able to talk about real issues without trying to engage in scapegoating.
Mm,
And at Boston College, we really value the importance of developing a community of civil discourse
mhm.
that isn't just polite, but is actually able to listen and hear the others. So for me, I felt like it was a success. I actually have stayed in touch with a number of the students. I'd say about four of the students are now working on Capitol Hill, equally in Democratic and Republican legislative offices. And so that I'm hopeful about that as well, because there's been a lot of anxiety about who's staffing these offices. Do these offices are they just full of young Christian nationalists? And I know that there's other perspectives and opinions out there as well.
That's great. I mean, it's just a really nice thing to hear. The universities are so important in terms of fostering dialogue and critical thinking. And it's also really hopeful to think that there would be good people with principles in both parties, because I think one thing that our hyper partisan, really divided moment forgets is that in order for the United States to function and be a democracy, we need great people in both parties who are opposed to things like racism.
Yeah.
That who can speak up when they hear that, whoever is advocating for that, really it's a value that we should all hold as Americans, especially given our history and what
Yeah.
we should have learned from the past.
Right. Yeah. 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 Exactly. I mean, I was really honored that one of the students who was Republican, a leader in the Young Republicans at BC, asked me to write a letter of reference for him for law school, which to me just showed he trusted me and that
Yeah.
he learned something from me. Um, I'm not sure if he guessed. I'll just be honest. My political leanings are not conservative, but I'm also critically reflective on politics in general in the United States. So I'm not sure if he figured out where I landed or not, but he trusted me, and that just meant a lot.
Yeah, it's very important, I think, and it's very difficult in this particular environment to have friends across the political divide. But I am definitely rooting for Republicans insofar as I love many Republicans and want them to have a party that is not coded with like racist dog whistles or just direct racism. And nor do I want that for Democrats. I want to live in a tolerant society where people of different races and ethnicities and religious views can speak to each other with respect and try to come together on places where they can meet. Like there's a lot that we all have in common and want, I think.
Yeah.
Um, so that's really important. And it's a great thing that can happen in the classroom when there's a little more time to have a deeper conversation. I want to say in closing, Dan, do you have anything like that you could offer as an alternative to Christian nationalism to people who are worried about Christian nationalism? Like, is there an alternative that you
Yeah.
see?
I think this is one of the big things. Uh, the scholars of an important book on Christian nationalism, The Flag and the Cross, Gorski and Perry, talk about Christian nationalism as offering a compelling, deep story about this country that's under threat. And so that's one of the challenges: is how do you write or offer an alternative, deep story? And one of the hunches I have is that we should look at the Black church
Mm,
as a source of an alternative deep story. Why is that? I don't know about you, but in the course of my life, I've encountered a lot of African Americans who have a background in military service. And actually, African Americans have disproportionate rates of military service, in part because it's a vehicle for social advancement. What we find in the Black church a lot is a kind of patriotism that's also critically reflective.
mhm.
Um, Despite all the experiences of slavery and Jim Crow, and we could go on and on about the challenges that Black Americans face. They believe that America is a place that God loves, that God has gifted it with particular bounties and benefits, and they're grateful for it. But it's a sense that there's so much bounty that can be shared with so many people. And so really it's, I think, flipping the paradigm to the abundance of America. I mean, think about the great song America, "Oh Spacious Skies," "Amber's Wave of Grain," "Purple Mountains' Majesty across their fruited plain." I sang that song when I was a kid in elementary school. We always had to sing a patriotic song at the beginning of each day, which I'm grateful for. And if we could just think about just the wonder, the abundance, the draw of America, and that we should just, if we could flip that paradigm to say there's actually enough here for everyone. If we make that argument, we then also need to change policies to reflect how much there is for everyone. I know one of your big concerns that you've been naming for people who are drawn to Christian nationalism is housing. Everyone is concerned about housing. The people for voting for Democratic Socialists of America are also primarily motivated by housing. Why is housing motivated so much? Because it's at the top of Maslow's pyramid, food and shelter. And if we could just change that narrative around that America's capable of creating abundance for everyone, and that's God. God desires abundance for everyone. I
Yeah.
think that would be a really compelling vision.
I think that's beautiful. So much has come out of the Black church. I mean, the civil rights movement came out of the Black church. There's so much wisdom there. And these are people who have a deep faith, as you said, who are also typically very patriotic in the sense of loving America and not believing that America is only for Black people or only for white people, that there's enough for both and for all. And that is really truly actually the more patriotic position in the sense that America, one of the things that makes us unique as a country is that from the beginning, we have had different ethnic groups be part of this project: Native Americans, African Americans, European Americans, immigrants from Italy, right from the very beginning. And so, actually, this kind of idea that it only belongs to this tiny group of people is not even historically correct. And so, we've always been a melting pot, and that's a big part of our identity that is generous and does come with a tremendous amount of bounty in and of itself, because with all those different groups coming together, we have had such creativity, such innovation. There's been so many amazing things that have come out of America, in part because we are a diverse nation that has drawn on different people who have immigrated here from different countries and have brought their gifts to this country and have benefited the country.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, that's my hope that we can create a broad coalition of people across the spectrum that can pivot us back to focusing on that kind of a narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate your time so much today and just sharing with us what you're teaching in your classroom. I hope we gave people like a little taste of what you're doing at
Well,
Boston
thank you
College.
so much. It was great to be here.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you, Dan.
You're welcome.